time here today. Again, welcome to 7 email re-engagement tips to win back your audience. First of all, I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. So we're going to be spending time here with Brad Gurley, who is MessageGear's Director of Deliverability. He works really hard to analyze our customer delivery data and research latest engagements to email technology and just make sure everybody's getting their emails to the people that they're intending to send them to. So we're really glad to have him here. And my name is Elspeth Russell. I am the social media and community manager here at MessageGears, and so glad to be here with you. We're going to start off a little with a few housekeeping items here. So just to start off, everybody's muted, but we do want interactivity here. So please engage with us via the chat window throughout the webinar, and there'll also be a couple polls coming, and we'd love to hear your insights there. And then additionally, you can also submit questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. We've already had a couple of really great questions come in from registrants, and so we're excited to chat through those, plus any others that are added once we get to that portion of the webinar. So finally, before I turn things over to Brad, I just wanted to remind everyone that you will be getting a recording of the webinar in your email tomorrow. So look out for that. And with that, I will turn things over to Brad.
All right, great. Well, I think before we get started, well, I guess first, thanks, Elspeth. Glad to be here and glad to take part in the webinar today. So we wanted to start things off by just asking a quick poll question. We wanted to get a little temp check for everyone here. And the question that we want to ask everyone is, how big of an impact do you feel like unengaged subscribers have on your success? So we wanted to ask it first. We didn't want you to like cheat with knowing all the info that we're going to give you in the session. So if you can, go ahead and start that.
Okay, everybody can weigh in here. We're collecting responses. All right, looks like we're pretty steady here, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Okay.
All right. And then we can go ahead and share the results here.
Yeah,
We've got 78% medium, they're not sure. 22% are extremely stressed out about unengaged subscribers. And Brad, don't feel upset about it, but 0% are here because they love you. So sorry about that.
Well, I mean, I am sorry about that, but the good news is that, most people are not too stressed out, although we want to try to help everybody in the kind of the medium or the really stressed out category. So hopefully we can do that today. All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Elspeth, for kind of running all of that poll. Thanks, everyone, for giving us a little bit of feedback on that as well. So with that said, let's jump right into the content. We want to talk through 7 tips for running a re-engagement campaign. And we know, it's October. We're coming up on the very busy holiday season for a lot of you. Some of you are already in the midst of it. Some of you may be preparing for it. We wanted to take the opportunity to go through a very hot topic during the holidays, which is, re-engaging subscribers, sending to people that maybe haven't engaged with your brand in a while, trying to get them back into the fold, and some tips around how and when, and even you'll see number 1, why you want to do that. So let's start out here with number 1, of course. This is something that, I've been doing this for a few years, working with marketers and senders that are trying to re-engage subscribers. And a lot of times there's not really a clear definition on why you're doing it. And I think that's, really a key to the process. If you're going to run a re-engagement campaign, you want to make sure you start with the why. Anytime that you're looking to send to recipients that haven't engaged, it's important to figure out what the drivers are behind that decision. In our illustration here, you'll see the end goal is typically profit in whatever form that takes for your organization. And of course, that's the overarching goal, typically for many things that you're going to do as a business. So here we want to talk a little more about the specific motivations around the campaign itself. We know that sending to unengaged recipients can represent a pretty significant risk to your reputation. So you want to be sure that before you undertake such a program that you know what you're realistically hoping to achieve. And then if those results are going to match up with the risk that's involved there. The temptation exists so often to just kind of viewing unengaged recipients as sort of a potential energy source, just waiting for an email to come along and convert them into a kinetic energy, force and revenue. But the thing about potential energy is sometimes it doesn't manifest the way you expect it to. Could turn out that all of that kinetic energy with those recipients blows up when they all, report the messages as spam or ignore it, and you get blocked to the ISP. So, don't want to get too extreme there of an example, but wanted to make sure that we kind of talk through what the possibilities are. So let's talk about some common drivers for re-engagement campaigns. So, typically we hear a few recurring themes. We're going to go through a couple of those here. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands or a poll on each of these, but if you know, you know. The first is crunch time, of course. We hear a lot of holiday season. Any time of the year or a season that traditionally generates a lot of revenue for your organization. These are, of course, the holiday season, Q4, the end of the quarter or end of year if you're on a quarterly or yearly cycle, and then sometimes just seasonal sales. Even if you're not necessarily a holiday focused on Q4, you're still going to have things that are time limited. So you really want to drive as many people as possible to know about those special offers, the dates of your sales, and so on there. On a little more general note, you can sometimes see falling revenues. That's a big issue, obviously, as a business. You want to see revenues continue to grow and increase. If you see that those are falling, that's going to be a concern for you. If you see that your database is shrinking, so if you're losing subscribers but not gaining new ones, if you're seeing just overall declines in numbers for people subscribing, people engaging, people purchasing, all of those things can make it very tempting to kind of brush off the cobwebs and try to re-engage some of those, very cold recipients that are in the database that maybe haven't shown any signs of life in quite a while. And the last one shouldn't require too much explanation. I was told to, and having done this for a while, I hear that one quite a lot. Many people here I know are on the execution side, so sometimes you can get a request from above. You want to make sure when that happens that you're doing things the right way. And for those of you who are, on the side where you're developing the strategy or even passing down that request to others, you're going to want to be sure that campaign runs as smoothly as possible also. So, regardless of where the directive comes from, everyone really has the same goal when it comes to re-engagement campaigns. We want to make sure that we're doing it the best way possible. Right? So, once you've determined kind of what triggered the efforts, you can say, what am I hoping to achieve here? What is the end goal? Do you just want to drive revenue for a specific holiday season? And, certainly that's reasonable. If you say, hey, this particular season, we're, numbers are down, we need to do an extra push to try to bring in some more revenue. Do you want to do something a little more kind of long-term where you want to grow your list to keep recipients loyal, to increase lifetime value for your recipients, or to even, bring people sort of back into your brand fold, if you will, that maybe have lost interest or haven't been as engaged with not just the purchasing and the actual kind of revenue driving things, but even the even engagement with your brand and not necessarily email. So, and then the last one, I put a bunch of question marks here because we often talk to marketers who just aren't sure what the end goal is. They're not really sure what they want to achieve through the re-engagement campaign. We know that revenue is the driver. Obviously, we know that there are some overarching themes, but they're not really sure exactly what it is that they think is going to happen by doing this re-engagement campaign. So if you can make this determination before you start, that's going to inform your decisions throughout this process and really help you with making the right decisions as you move forward. All right. So number two, we've talked about why we want to do this. So now that we've got a good understanding of that, let's talk about what is unengaged. There are many, many ways to define engagement when we're looking at email. Conversions and revenue, obviously, because they're sort of the end goal, those are generally going to be the most accurate and most effective. But in a lot of cases, the data set you're working with there is pretty small. You may have conversions only on, a single-digit percentage of your list. What about the rest of the list? They're not necessarily lost causes. That they still have some potential for revenue, but they haven't necessarily purchased yet. So we want to look at different metrics that might be able to give us some approximation of that. So we've got a lot of available data points. We know that open rates really are the most common. but they're also sort of the most controversial. So even though open and click data can be flawed, particularly open data, it can still give us a good starting point for defining what we call an engage. So we can still look at trends. We can still look at some general data to understand what it is that's happening with these recipients. So we want to look right now at sort of a microcosm. We'll start with an isolated view of engagement, and that's just a single message. So you send a single message, what's going to happen with that particular email campaign. So with MPP and other kind of similar proxy image loads, it's tricky to find a definitive metric for what we would call real human opens. We know that we're sort of approximating based on pixel loads, but the research that we've done, along with a number of published sources out there in the industry, puts the average open rate for marketing emails right around 21%. So if we use that as our kind of guideline here, we can assume that roughly 21% of the recipients for any given message are going to open. We also know, again, kind of same internal research along with some external published metrics as well, that when you look at the unsubscribe rate for marketing emails, it's generally between 1/10 and 0.3%, and the average bounce rate is around 1%. So we sort of combine those here for purposes of our visual. So about 1.3% are either bouncing, they're not receiving the message, or they're unsubscribing. So we don't really need to count those in our engagement metrics. But when we subtract that, okay, we start with 100, 21% open, 1.5% roughly unsubscribe or bounce. We've still got almost 80% of recipients who are still subscribed. They're going to continue to get emails, but they're not engaged. So we understand that looking at a single message is not necessarily what we're doing here. We're going to go a little bit wider, but we wanted to give a kind of a drilled down view of a specific message to really get a feel for what is engagement as a whole. What does it look like on a small level? And then for the next slide, we're going to look at it on a little bit more macro level. Right? So we want to define metrics around unengaged by looking over time generally. This is sort of a larger view of engagement data. This is based on some trend data for around 500 million unique recipients. And I think this data goes back to the beginning of 2022. So we're looking at roughly 20 months of data here, 19, 20 months. And we can see early on in early 22, mail privacy protection, Apple's big proxy load, was still sort of gaining ground. It was still being adopted by a lot of folks, and we also see that's kind of the tail end of the engagement window. So for this particular chart that we're doing here, we were looking at a 12-month engagement window. So these are recipients who did not engage in the past 12 months. So strangely, we see that it's larger before mail privacy protection, or not strangely, excuse me. It is larger before mail privacy protection because we know that a lot of those engagements that we're seeing since then are artificial. But we do see that 20 to 25% is what we saw when mail privacy protection was not yet really rolled out or really fully adopted, while we were still in that 12-month adjustment period. And then about a year after mail privacy protection took effect, we see the lowest unengagement rates that we saw. So just not much above 10% here. And that lets us know that, okay, so mail privacy protection really gave us a pretty large impact over, what we saw in January 22 versus what we saw in, October of 2022. But then we see those numbers start to climb back up a little for unengaged. So, we're still seeing, 10 to 15% of recipients in most cases, and that's on average. You can see that it spikes up even closer to 20 there. But that many recipients are not only not, actively humanly opening email, but not even recording a proxy email, not even recording a proxy load or pixel load. So they don't have the mail account in an Apple device, they're not checking in or they don't have it plugged in. So that gives us some really good insight there. So even though, some of these opens that are attributed to Apple, it still lets us know that someone has that mail account on a device. They're using that device. So they're not necessarily fully unengaged in some senses. But these, 10 to 15% here, we know, there's really sort of no sign of life for them. So we want to continue to really target those and look at how we can try to re-engage those. Based on this data here, we do see that, for our purposes, open pixel loads can still be a reliable metric. But we just have to read them in the right context and see them as, okay, this is someone who really is totally unengaged in that they're not even checking the mail on a device that's Apple. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention some of the other metrics that are often used to define engagement. Purchases, as we've talked about a couple of times already, they're really the main driver of most of your marketing, of course, and they're the obvious answer. But what about things like website traffic? Are they logging into an account? Are they logging into a loyalty program? Are they logging into the mobile app? So all of those things could be proxies for engagement as well. It can be a little bit tricky when we're talking about logins, because we do know that users tend to keep logins even after changing email addresses in some cases. We definitely have seen this when trying to troubleshoot issues with customers before, that there may be folks who log into the app regularly, but they actually got rid of that email address months ago or years ago even. So it's not a huge problem in that we do see some people update theirs. We don't see a ton of overlap there, but there absolutely is potential for risk there. So we would say use the multiple pieces of data that you have. If you have open pixel loads, if you have clicks, if you have purchases, use those in conjunction with this data. And then there's also visits to a brick and mortar store. They can signal it as well. In most cases, of course, you're only going to know about store visits if there's a purchase involved. We do have some clients that use some geolocation and app push type notifications to trigger things when you're at the store location. So that does present some interesting opportunities. There's some potential to use some of that data, but with that, you want to be very careful around kind of privacy concerns, what permissions you have and consent you have from the recipient to do that. And for all of these, it's really important to keep in mind that email providers can only see what happens in an email. So if we're talking about Gmail, they don't know that this person went into the store and bought something last week. They can only see this person hasn't opened an email in more than a year. So we recommend using these types of metrics more as a secondary metric. So if you have other data there that indicates, maybe they opened, 10 or 11 months ago, but you see that they purchased last week, that can be a good bolster for data that you already have. But if you have someone who's completely unengaged, just showing one of these signals may not necessarily be a sign of life that you hope it is. So, right. Next, we want to determine, exactly who we're targeting with these campaigns, so that your re-engagement, your win-back campaigns, or retention campaigns, I know they're called a lot of times. You want to find out, who in your audience is going to receive those. So if you just start blasting promos to your full audience of unengaged recipients, you're going to have a bad time. Instead, you need to be smart about how you're targeting unengaged recipients. That way you're going to minimize the risk. You're going to increase the chances that they're actually going to receive the message, which is the entire point of why we're doing this campaign to begin with. Right. So we put together a little sort of risk spectrum here, if you will. As a general rule, the longer since a recipient engaged, the more risky it is to send to them. So for anyone who may not be familiar or just needs a refresher, the primary risks are that, some of these old addresses that haven't shown any sign of engagement, they haven't opened, they haven't purchased anything, they may no longer want your messages. So it could be that they've just kind of lost interest in your brand. They may have abandoned the mailbox altogether. So maybe they don't even use that address anymore, and they, deleted their account. That email address could even be rolled over to another person. So it could be that you're actually mailing to a valid address, but the address now belongs to someone else because it sat, unused for a period of time and got reassigned. And sort of the worst case scenario, if you will, is that they can be recycled as spam trap or censor addresses. So those are addresses that block list operators, reputation services, they use those types of addresses to determine who might be sending to addresses that have questionable acquisition practices, we'll say. So if they get a message that they say, we know we didn't sign up for this message, therefore we're going to flag the sender of this. So in any of those scenarios, those can get your IP address or your domain blocked by the recipient. You can get on a block list that might cause widespread blocks, or you may be on a specific, mailbox provider's block list. But in any case, there's definitely an increased level of risk as you get back into those older recipients there. So even for addresses that are still in use by the original recipient, if they're showing no interest and you keep consistently sending to them and they keep showing no interest, mailbox providers will see that as well, and that will also potentially harm your sender reputation. So when we look at the specifics of the chart here, there's always going to be some variation anytime that you're correlating engagement window and risk. In the case of extremely seasonal businesses, for example, so if your product is only useful for 1 month out of the year, typically, you're probably not going to see a lot of engagement the other 11 months out of the year. But in any case, these are baseline practices. We've developed these after a lot of experience, a lot of research with different clients, and we do think these are broadly applicable for most senders. So even though there are edge cases, we think for the most part, this is a good place to start. So looking at the spectrum here, anyone who hasn't engaged 2 years or more, sending to them is going to be considered highly risky and definitely not recommended. There are very, very few exceptions to that. I have worked with 1 or 2 clients in my almost 20 years of doing this where they did have a legitimate reason and kind of practice to send to those. But in the vast majority of cases, you really want to stay away from the 24 plus months engagement window there. They carry a very high likelihood of damaging your reputation, but potentially more importantly, there's a very low likelihood of them actually providing any value. So when we're looking at the kind of risk reward proposition, the risk is much higher than the reward when you're looking at these very old or kind of very stale, if you will, recipients. As you move lower in the engagement spectrum, the level of risk is going to decrease. So, you see from the 18 to 24 month window, it's still a high risk, but definitely lower than the 24 plus month window. The 12 to 18 month window is what we call moderate risk. That's typically where we put most recommendations. So we would recommend for most senders that the 12 to 18 month window is probably where you should be targeting with your re-engagement campaigns. But we have worked with clients who, work on a lot of different cycles. So we have some clients that we've worked with on, who a 6 to 12 month engagement window is actually still a pretty big jump for them. So, you might be targeting based on 30 or 90-day engagement. So if you are, then even, jumping up to that 6 month or 9 month or 12 month window is still going to be a pretty large increase for you. So there is going to be a sort of a continuum there depending on your own practices. But as a whole, this is a general risk idea. Right. All right. So as you decide which recipients to target, you also need to keep in mind that only sending to unengaged recipients in a given day is likely to cause you some reputation damage. So, it's likely to hinder you getting mail delivered to your engaged recipients because the mailbox providers will see that, on a given day or a given week or, whatever period of time, they only saw this unengaged mail. So it had very kind of lower response rates, high complaint rates, high bounce rates potentially. So as we see that, Link learned pretty early on in his journey, unengaged recipients also need to have something to take along with them to make things a little safer. And that's where engaged recipients come in. So you want to make sure that you're sending the win-back campaigns or your re-engagement messaging alongside your regular mail to engaged recipients. So, let's say a given day, you typically send, 100,000 messages to engaged recipients, then you can send a smaller portion to your unengaged recipients in the same day. So we're going to take a look at the next chart here and actually go through some of those specific details. So what do we recommend from a targeting perspective when you're looking at the different engagement windows? So we recommend a pretty conservative approach as a general rule to balancing your engaged and unengaged traffic. These, again, as we said earlier, are recommendations based on our experience with senders of all sizes. We believe that they represent the optimal range for most brands, but they may not exactly line up with what you're doing. So if your organization typically sends to recipients who engage in the past 12 months, then that 6 to 12 month window isn't necessarily going to be relevant for you. But if you do that and you now want to expand out to 18 months for your re-engagement campaign, that's where this kind of 5% window would come into play. So just to clarify what we're looking at here, this is the percentage of your total daily traffic that's made up of recipients that you're trying to engage. So as we mentioned earlier, let's say your typical marketing volume is 1 million emails per day. And whatever your unengaged audience is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but wherever you determine your unengagement window is, this is the percentage you want to look at. So let's say you're looking at 12 to 18 months again, and you typically send 1 million a day. Your re-engagement campaign volume should be maxed out at about 50K a day. That's obviously a pretty small number when you're looking at your total overall volume. But we've seen, many cases where trying to push that number and kind of expand beyond that can cause reputation damage, can really cause some things to go south, and stop messages from getting delivered to those folks who really have been engaging, who have been your kind of most loyal recipients there. So one thing to keep in mind is you see here, these are kind of 6-month windows. So, if you're between the 6 to 12-month window, there is some flexibility there. Let's say, you typically send to people who engaged in the past 6 months, but now you want to do a re-engagement campaign to 6 to 9-month recipients. So because, those 6 to 9 months are a little newer than the full 6 to 12 months, you may be able to increase your volume a little bit and say, 15% max of your daily volume. But typically, we don't recommend going over 15% of your daily volume to any recipients that you kind of know to be unengaged based on whatever your unengaged criteria is. Again, we know these estimates are pretty conservative. There is going to be some flexibility for the lower numbers. So again, your 6 to 12 months, and even for some senders, the 12 to 18 months, where you may have a higher percentage of engagement in that window than most senders. So you may be able to bump that up just a little bit. So that's where we do recommend kind of speaking with an expert or kind of getting some additional insight there. But you do have some flexibility if you're seeing engagement in those windows there. And again, here we see 24 months as 0. So, we do recommend, anytime that you need to send to recipients more than 24 months, we're going to consider that kind of a unique circumstance, and we don't try to include that in our general guidelines. All right. Okay, so the next step is going to be planning your timetable. So, based on the percentages that we just talked about, it's likely you're going to need more than a few days to get a re-engagement campaign done. If you're sending kind of very small percentages to try and make sure that you're not hurting your reputation, you're going to need a little bit of a run-up period for that and some time to do that before your target date. So, our absolute best practice recommendation is to run ongoing campaigns throughout the year. So to kind of regularly be re-engaging and trying to win back recipients who are showing signs of being unengaged. But I also realize, if I host a webinar in October and I tell you that you should have been running your re-engagement campaign all year, they're probably not going to give me another webinar anytime soon. So we're going to talk through the specifics of, how can you plan that timetable if you're not running, an ongoing re-engagement campaign and you're looking to do something more one-off. The good news is, one-off time-limited re-engagement campaigns absolutely work. That's what we're going to focus on for the next few recommendations here, because we know, especially based on the timing, that this is going to be something that's relevant to a lot of you. So the most relevant recommendation we can make in kind of a general perspective is plan ahead. If you have a specific target date in mind, we know right now Black Friday, Cyber Monday are a big one for many of you. You want to make sure that you allow enough time in advance of that date to fully target the unengaged recipient. Excuse me. On the other hand, you don't want to do the re-engagement campaign too early, because you don't want it to wrap up, weeks before your target date. So if you have that target date and, 6 weeks before that date, you finish your re-engagement campaign, then, what's happening to those folks who are maybe in a little bit of limbo for that 6-week period? So there is going to be somewhat of a balance there. We typically say 3 to 5 weeks is a good frame of reference if you're kind of early on in the planning process, but these are going to vary pretty widely depending on, how large is your engaged audience, how large is your unengaged audience, and how frequently do you send. Obviously, if you send every day, you're going to have a little shorter ramp there. If you're a brand who sends maybe once a week or once every couple of weeks, then you're going to need a little bit longer window. So definitely some flexibility there depending on your specifics. The number of messages of the campaign matters also. You definitely want to give recipients more than one chance to engage, but you want to avoid the potential of annoying them, and driving more spam complaints. So, by limiting it to just a few messages, you can create a real sense of urgency, and it can push the reader to engage. In our experience, we've seen that senders who send 2 to 4 messages in a re-engagement campaign tend to see the most success. Again, there certainly are some controls depending on your audience and a number of different factors with the way that you're sending mail. But as a general rule, that 2 to 4 window seems to be very, very profitable, we'll say. Sending more than 4, you kind of get to the point where you're getting diminishing returns. So, very few people are actually going to engage after 4 messages, but they may be more likely to mark you as spam or to ignore the message, and that's going to hurt your reputation as well. And then sending cadence is the last piece here. We do generally recommend not sending a re-engagement message every day. And the primary reason for that is because those campaigns are going to have a higher likelihood of driving complaints because we know that they're recipients who haven't shown interest, and those complaints, of course, can impact your reputation. In a lot of cases, when you see those reputation impacts, they may take a couple of days to really show up for you to even see a signal of that. So, we'll use Google Postmaster tools as the example here because we know that's a very popular one. They typically run about a day to a day and a half behind real time with their reputation updates. So, any changes to your reputation at Gmail, you generally wouldn't even be able to see until a minimum of a day after your send's complete. In some cases, even a day and a half to 2 days. So, by limiting to every second or even third day, if you've got the flexibility to do that, that allows you to avoid kind of compounding any of those reputation damages that you're running into there. So if you do see on day 2 that our reputation dropped at Gmail, you can either stop or temporarily pause the next message to try and see if you can recover the reputation before you restart the campaign. Okay. All right. So, now that we've talked through some of the timing, we can discuss content. So it's a fairly overused saying that, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results. Maybe, I guess you could say that about using that phrase as well. But, maybe I want the same results, so who knows? It does apply pretty well to this situation. I've seen many marketers will just find your unengaged contacts. They'll kind of pull them out, identify who they are, and then just drop them right back into the kind of regular audience logic and regular promo rotation. And you really want to have some specific efforts to drive their engagement, because these are subscribers that had plenty of chances to engage with your email content and they didn't. So, when you think through that, why would they now start interacting with the same content that they've been ignoring for weeks or months, or, in some cases, maybe a year and a half, so we really want to look at some creative content that you can use for the re-engagement campaign. I know, and we've got a weird formatting issue here, so hopefully this is clear here. But I know that most of you are pretty savvy marketers already, so there's not a whole lot in this content section that's probably going to come as a surprise to you. But we do want to emphasize some of the specific elements of good design that are really especially relevant to win-back campaigns. So we'll see here. We've got an example here from Sharper Image, who actually is a client of ours. I believe you may have someone on the call as well. And we get a good kind of attention grabbing subject line. So we want to immediately differentiate from other campaigns when we look at that subject line. That's going to be the first impression of the email. Again, not just for re-engagement campaigns, this applies to every email, but it allows the reader to kind of very quickly realize that this is not the same marketing message that they've scrolled past, over and over in the last 6 months. That there's something different in this message, and it grabs their attention. And it's not gimmicky. It's not giving them misdirection. Hey, get a free car, and then they open and there's no free car there. So this is there's a good balance here that you have to have. So you want to make sure that you are maybe pushing your boundaries a little bit with trying to be not necessarily aggressive, but be bolsterous. And we've seen customers see success with using emojis or certain languages or coupons and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different opportunities to use that subject line in a way that maybe you haven't tried with your with your typical marketing, and you may find some things that work for your larger list as a whole. Branding, as we reference it here, really primarily is specific to the from address, domain, and from name. So, you want to use something that the reader recognizes easily as your brand. So, the from name should be, very consistent, very easily recognizable. The domain that you use in that from address, again, should be, kind of your organization's domain, something that they're used to seeing. And even, within the message, so when you look at the message preview, for example, you want to see that branding. So you want to see, the logo at the top, kind of the color schemes that they expect to see. And what that does is, helps ensure the recipient does feel safe interacting with the email and potentially clicking those links. So they've got the attention grabbing piece in the subject line and maybe even in the kind of the header of the message. But they also can trust, based on the branding, based on the information that they see there, that this is the brand that I think it is, and they're really trying to, win me back, and they're trying to get some engagement from me. And then finally, body content. Again, a very small portion of body content. There are a lot of other things to talk about, but for re-engagement specifically, once you've gotten someone to open, you've crossed that first hurdle. Use the body content to call it exactly what action you want them to take. make the CTA clear. But also, it may be a good idea to give other options. And you see that in the example here that, we've got that big, $25 off shop now button, but then we also have kind of more specific buttons for bestsellers, for new arrivals, men's, women. So you've got a lot of different options that someone can, very easily click that initial sort of, hero CTA, if we want to call it that. But they also have other options to be able to click through, buy, and engage with the email. So we want to give them a good reason to engage, and we want to make it easy for them to do. All right. So, once you determine your timetable, your cadence, you've got some content created, we're going to step back to the audience for a bit. So, you've defined the audience as unengaged. Now, what do you do? We generally recommend, as a best practice, to start sending with the most recently engaged recipients, and I think that's a fairly common best practice. So, for example, if you decided that your audience is anyone who engaged between 9 and 18 months ago, you would generally want to start that campaign with recipients who engaged, 9 to 10 months ago first. So we'll take a look here. This is sort of a visualization of a sample situation. So this, is the way you might operate a win-back campaign that targets 9 to 18 month engagers. Or excuse me, 9 to 18 month, they're your kind of win-back campaign, but they last engaged between 9 and 18 months ago, just to make that clear. And there's roughly 20,000 recipients that fall into that category. So, typically you're sending to people who engaged in the last 9 months. You want to expand that out for your re-engagement campaign. How might you go about doing that? So, you're starting on day one here. You see your typical campaign is 50,000 recipients that are, engagers who clicked in or, opened or clicked in the last 9 months. But we're adding in an additional 4,000 recipients who opened from between 9 and 10 months ago. So, when we go back to our charts from earlier, when we're looking at the percentages, we could potentially go up to, 5,000 recipients on that day based on the general guidelines there. But it just so happens for our purposes, it breaks out that only 4,000 of them opened between 9 and 10 months ago. So we'll use that as our number here. But you've got some level of flexibility, but you also want to make sure that you're targeting them, the more engaged recipients first, because you're going to see more engagement from those. They're going to be more likely to actually come back into the fold, if you will. So what you'll really see, and we didn't necessarily account for it here because it generally takes more than a couple of days for this to show up, but you're going to start seeing some of these 4,000 now start rolling into the typical engaged audience. So you may see this go up by a few hundred or 1,000 as you go through the day 5 or day 6 or whatever. So what that's going to do is allow you to sort of slowly ramp up that volume while letting the mailbox providers recognize that, okay, the volume is ramping up, but it's in a very kind of methodical fashion. And it also minimizes any potential negative impact that might happen from these, unengaged recipients. If we get higher than normal complaints, by limiting them to a small percentage of the engaged audience, then we are limiting the overall number of complaints and rates that we get there. So as we go from day 1 to day 2, we're kind of holding off. So again, tying this all back together with our previous recommendations, we recommend taking at least 1 day off between the two, kind of re-engagement campaigns there. So we send just to our regular engaged audience day 2. Day 3, we go back to bringing in some additional engagers. So now we're bringing in the 11 to 12 month engagers. So we've added 4,000 of those. So there's certainly some flexibility around how you do this. You could send to both 9 to 10 month engagers, and then bring them in this larger audience, but and then add on the 11 to 12 month as well. But the real key piece here, is just that we're aggregating things in a way that's going to keep those spam complaint numbers, those unengaged numbers that the mailbox providers see, to a very small portion of your audience. So by making that a limited section, by taking the day off in the middle, we're all helping to kind of mitigate some of the risks that are present there. Right. And one reason that we look at daily, I wanted to bring this up as well before we move on. Most mailbox providers do aggregate data daily. So that's why we generally say, look at days. Now, each one might be in a different time zone that they're using the aggregation. So it's not going to be a precise kind of calendar clock day every day, but a rough period. So a rough 24-hour period is kind of the starting point for most of the mailbox providers. And then they do also have some kind of real-time or near real-time filtering. So let's say, if you start sending your re-engagement campaign at 9 a.m. And you send, all 4,000 at once. and they see a lot of complaints come in, there's some potential that, you know, those sort of real-time or near real-time filters are going to start filtering the rest of the mail that comes throughout the day. So, you know, two things that you can do to mitigate that: throttle the unengaged recipients. So generally we recommend kind of having them split up as separate audiences if it's possible. So, or at least where you can kind of manage them separately, even if it's through kind of a blueprint or something like that. That allows you to both, you know, kind of throttle out the unengaged audience, and it allows you to maybe send those a little bit later than the engaged audience. So if you send the unengaged audience first on a given day, any potential negative impact from that might impact any later sends, which would be at that point your engaged audience. So we generally recommend send to the engaged recipients first in the day, throttle out the unengaged recipients over the course of the day, and then continue that as you move on through the process. All right, and then you know, speaking of kind of monitoring for deliverability issues and you know, watching for throttling and that sort of thing, another benefit to kind of separating out those two audiences is that it does make it easier to identify bounce patterns and trends for that group. So we know that the unengaged recipients are going to get, you know, generally more bounces, you know, more spam complaints, that sort of thing. During that whole process, we want to keep a close eye on the types of bounces that we receive, because they're going to inform kind of how we want to proceed. So depending on your provider, you may be very familiar with these kind of detailed delivery status notifications, or DSNs as we call them. You may also just see general categories like spam bounce, invalid recipient, mailbox full, etc. So, you know, whichever kind you get, if you get these detailed responses, or if you get the more general categories, you're going to want to pay extra attention to any bounces that reference a spam block, you know, sender reputation, poor reputation, an address that doesn't exist anymore, an invalid recipient. So, you know, looking at the examples that we have here, I know, you know, we're not going to read through the full text of each one, but you'll notice that each one essentially refers to some sort of throttling or delaying the delivery of the mail or deferring the mail. So basically slowing down the amount of mail that they're accepting. And for, you know, each of these, it's generally related to a reputation issue. So they're seeing either, you know, too many complaints, or the reputation is poor. So, you know, these are the types of throttles and deferrals that come from, you know, volume increases in a lot of cases. So, you know, if you increase volume too quickly, the providers will see that unexpected increase in volume. Yahoo, particularly, you know, for increases in volume, you know, is very, very kind of sensitive to that. So, if they see anything there, okay. All right. You know, if you're following, or sorry, one more thing here. You know, if you're able to view these DSNs, so if you can see this kind of detailed bounce notification, key terms to look for here are words like throttle, deferred, rate limit, or try again later. All of those are kind of, you know, indications that you may have a throttling or reputation issue that you need to address. All right, so that is the last of our, you know, 7 key tips that we're going to give here. But we do have one more poll that we want to get into. So, yeah, Elspeth, I think if you want to run that, you know, we want to know how often your team is evaluating deliverability, and then you've got some options here of what you choose.
All right, so here we go. We'll give a minute for the answers to come in. All right. Okay, I think we're looking pretty steady now. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll so we can take a look at the results. All right. So we can see here we've got 83% are checking monthly or more, which is great. Yeah. We've got 8% doing quarterly, 0% annually, and then 8% next to never.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go ahead and hide the results here.
Okay.
All right.
All right. And I think, yeah, I think 8% of you, we need to have a conversation. If you're, if it's next to never, maybe we can chat. So, all right. So, you know, I did mention that, you know, we've gone through our 7 tips for re-engagement. We did want to add one quick sort of bonus tip here. We mentioned earlier that our best practice recommendation is to make re-engagement an ongoing process. So, we're hoping that even if you're doing kind of a one-off campaign now, that in the future, maybe you'll look at sort of an ongoing re-engagement process. And we wanted to mention a couple of recent changes that could impact those long-term win-back efforts, and really all of your marketing email, honestly, into 2024 and beyond. So, in full transparency, these are not specific to re-engagement campaigns, but we do know they're top of mind for a lot of marketers, and we wanted to at least give a brief mention of them here. So I know I want to be respectful of your time and make sure we get to questions, so I'll run through these very quickly here. iOS 17 link tracking. Last month, Apple released iOS 17 to iPhones and iPads with a new feature called link tracking protection. So it's designed to remove parameters from email or from web links that can be used to track users across multiple websites. Most of you are probably familiar, maybe even had a little minor freak out, as most of us did. But let's see kind of what's happening now. This could be relevant to your re-engagement campaigns if you're using some of those additional data points that we talked about before. So if you're looking at purchases, website visits, those sorts of things. If you were using sort of cross-site, cookies or trackers that allow you to track people across different, channels, then you could see, the loss of some of that in your link tracking there. So that's why we wanted to bring that up. If that's the case, if you are using those, you may have lost some of those details that you previously relied upon. So, our testing showed that the tracking parameters that were removed were mostly web specific, and a lot of them were specific to the major providers like Google and Meta. But there were some more kind of niche tracking parameters that came out as well that may be used by somebody. And then, also in early October, we got a big announcement from Gmail and Yahoo. Again, probably heard of this, but we wanted to bring it up very briefly. They announced some changes to their requirements for authentication. These include requirements that the from address is aligned with the SPF and/or DKIM domain in messages, and a requirement that all senders publish a DMARC record. They're also requiring a one-click unsubscribe method, preferably the list unsubscribe header. Prior to now, these were all sort of recommended best practices. They've now been elevated and sort of codified as required elements now. So, enforcement for these is going to start in February 2024. And anybody who's not complying with these is generally not going to be able to reach the mailbox, or excuse me, the inbox successfully at Gmail and Yahoo. So we know that other providers have discussed making some similar changes with the end goal being for all of them to prevent any mail that's not fully authenticated from being delivered, essentially. Okay. All right. So with that said, I think I've finished up with my part. So we'll get into the Q&A here.
Okay. So we've had a question come in from Michael here. He asks, Brad, do you recommend sending emails for unengaged people from a different server so that the main server's reputation isn't damaged?
Good question. We generally wouldn't recommend that because the logic behind that is that we think if there is enough of a risk that it's going to cause that much damage to your main engaged emails, then maybe you should rethink the specifics of that re-engagement campaign. I think, and I don't say that I don't say that flippantly. I think that I've seen that situation. I've worked with customers in that situation many times. Like if there's a real kind of palpable risk that it is going to really damage the campaigns that are not to unengaged, then maybe you scale it back and start with those smaller windows. So, we talked through kind of looking at maybe the 6 to 9 month window or the 9 to 12 month window. So, if you've got that much of a concern, we recommend trying to send it from the same architecture, but starting smaller. So maybe looking at a smaller percentage, run sort of a test campaign to sort of the most recently unengaged, if you will, and see what the percentage and what the engagement is for those. So you can generally tell from those test campaigns, like, okay, is this going to be something that's very problematic, or are we getting a pretty decent response and can afford to expand this out?
Okay. So our next question that came in is, what are some ways to get people engaged who simply will not or do not want to subscribe back to email, but would still like to hear from you through other channels?
Oh, okay, so we definitely work with a lot of senders, and I know most of you here that I've worked with anyway are multi-channel. So you're not just sending emails. You may be mobile push. You may be SMS. You may be even postal mail in a lot of cases. Phone calls in some cases for a lot of the nonprofits, especially and kind of political senders. So um, there are always going to be other channels to get in touch with someone in most cases. So if someone really is not showing any engagement with email, I think we have to honor that. But there are certainly ways to get creative around that. I've seen situations where senders who had phone number information would give a call. And of course, it depends on your audience, the size of your audience, the makeup of your audience. Would it be completely off-putting? If you got a call from a major retailer that said, "Hey, did you open our email?" Potentially. So you may want to think through kind of the implications of that and what your general audience looks like. But there are definitely ways to reach out to someone and either continue to engage them through phone or mail or SMS or push or just kind of app notifications, but also maybe to get them back to email. I've actually seen folks send out a postcard that says, "Hey, we noticed you haven't read our emails and you never engaged, so we took you off the list, but let us know if you want to be re-engaged." And of course, that's not going to make sense for everyone, but there are generally a lot of different ways to do that. I think most of them depend on your business, your audience, and kind of your brand voice in a lot of cases.
Okay. So we just got a question in from Laura here. So you suggest sending 2 separate emails. 90% engaged gets a normal send, and then a second email to 10% unengaged on the same day as the re-engagement plan?
Yes, yeah, that's typically the recommendation, and that's what we were talking through here. And apologies if that was not exceedingly clear, but yeah. So the campaign to the unengaged recipients should be sent alongside the campaign to the engaged recipients, but the content really should be geared towards getting them to engage. Now, one caveat to that, and we do have a retailer or two who are doing this, where if you've got folks who are either just barely re-engaged, or excuse me, just barely unengaged, we'll say, or very recently have become unengaged, you may be able to drop them back into a rotation, and a particular retailer that we work with will send kind of the best performing email to those recipients. So they say, "Hey, we've got an email that performed really well this week, and we've got these folks who are kind of in danger of becoming unengaged, or maybe just became unengaged. So we're sending them this very high performing email just to see if they'll kind of jump back into the fold." So there are certainly some alternative ways to do that, but generally, if you're running a full-on kind of one-time re-engagement campaign, we do recommend having dedicated messaging for that 5 to 10% of the audience there.
Okay, so another question we have come in is, when should you feel comfortable with just removing subscribers off your list?
That is always a hot button topic. So, I think, it is, I say this a lot because this is kind of our mantra, especially in deliverability. It depends, but it really does depend. I think if you've seen someone, that hasn't engaged in 24 months, again, in most cases, with very few exceptions, they probably are somewhat of a lost cause at that point for an email engagement. But for some audiences, if they haven't engaged in 12 months, they may be a lost cause to you. So depending on how engaged your audience typically is and what level of kind of drop off you see from that initial engagement. So if you're a brand that gets super high engagement on a daily or weekly basis, and everybody 80% of your list is engaged in the last 6 months, let's say, then past 12 months may be the cutoff for you. So 24 months is kind of the across the board, like almost nobody should be sending to older than 24 months. But once you get below that, there is some level of dependency on what your audience looks like and what your engagement looks like.
All right, and we have one more question here, and it is, to discount or not to discount? Does a discount in re-engagement harm the data in the long run?
That is another question that gets a lot of heated debate. I actually have been in the room with some heated debates about that question. So that is going to be another one that's going to depend a lot on your brand. So I know, we've got some retailers who see great success by including discounts. I think short term, you're almost always going to see success from discounts. So, not every situation, but most situations, a discount is going to drive some short term engagement. In a lot of cases, it's also going to keep them, on board. So, I think it depends on how frequently you're running these re-engagement campaigns. So, if you're doing it, once a year or once every couple years, then I don't know that discount's going to help you in the long run, because it might drive engagement for right now, but we're tying back to sort of, what is your end goal of this re-engagement campaign? So if the goal is, hey, we really need them to purchase this holiday season, and beyond that, we'll kind of cross that bridge when we get there, then yes, discount, get them in the door, get them to buy something now, and you can look at the long term later. If your goal is more to increase, lifetime value, then maybe you look at an alternative from discounts, or maybe you send more frequent re-engagement campaigns. Maybe you send those kind of soft re-engagement campaigns a couple of times a year just to keep someone engaged. Maybe they're not fully off the board, so to speak, but they're still, thinking about losing interest. But if you send them, a discount a couple of times a year, maybe once a quarter, again, depending on the audience, that might be enough to kind of keep them in the fold and keep them engaging and purchasing.
Okay, and I said that was the last question, but I was mistaken. We do have one more question, so I'm going to sneak that in here. So in the not engaged in the past X months and risk evaluation, how many emails should the recipient have received to properly evaluate this?
Ooh, that one. Okay, I'll think about that one for a second. So we've done this on a number of different levels with clients. So, again, depending on sending cadence, if you send twice a week, and that recipient has been in your audience for 6 months, then we would, assume that they've received roughly, what's that, 8 times 6, so 48. So they've received, roughly 45 to 50 emails. If you send once a month to recipients and they haven't engaged in 6 months, they've received 6 emails. So, again, looking at your audience, I think we look a lot of times at the percentages of engagement. So we have a kind of a graph of engagement that we look at of, okay, who's engaged in the last 30 days, 90 days, 6 months, 9 months or a year. And if you see those trends moving in the way that, almost everyone engages in that 6 months, then maybe you need fewer messages. If you see that, you're seeing pretty low engagement in that first 6 months, then you've got some flexibility there. So it's going to be whatever your regular sending cadence is. If you're somebody that sends once a month, I would probably say maybe look at that 9 to 12 month window for your engagement as opposed to the 6 month window. So, my estimate would be generally probably 10-ish messages is what I would like to see as a minimum, although I've seen successful campaigns that use 5 messages as the cutoff if someone had received 5 messages in the past 6 months, and I've seen some that were someone received 50 messages in the past 6 months. So a good starting point for that might be roughly around 10 messages.
Okay, great. Well, I think that does wrap up our questions there. So just wanted to remind everyone again, we will be sending out the recording, so you'll be getting an email from us with that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone. Certainly, if you have questions, feel free to reach out afterwards, but otherwise, keep an eye out for that recording. And thanks again for attending.
Thanks, everyone.